This is the Let People Prosper show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. Thank you for joining us today. We've got a lot to talk about, and so I really just want to jump right in. We've got a great guest, really one of the people that I've followed for a number of years through my academic time, through grad school. One of my mentors, Dr. Ronald Gilbert at Texas Tech, that was one of the main readings we had was by Dr. John Taylor and learning about the Taylor rule and everything else. And after that, I had the great opportunity when I was at the White House in the Trump administration to have some key conversations with Dr. Taylor, John, if I can, throughout this show. Okay, good. And so we had discussions as things were going on with COVID and the shutdowns and the economic effects and everything else. And I want to get into some of that as we go through our discussion today. But I thought, who else would be best to have on with so many things that are going on in the economy right now? And we've had some good discussion on this show on economic policy and the effects that it has on states, on the local governments, and also the federal and just the national economy as a whole. And so I thought with John being on the show and having his background, we'll have a good discussion about kind of where we've been, where we're at now, and where we should be heading. Because right now, we're not in a situation where people are prospering like they should. Government's too big. There's too much that's going on. Monetary policy had too much discretion. I would say fiscal policy has too much discretion. And so how do we get back on track? And so that's really what we're going to talk about today. So thank you for joining us. Now, I don't always do this, but I think it's important for us to, or I'm going to read John's bio. And I know from his perspective, he probably doesn't want to hear it. But I think it'd be important for our audience to really know, what he's done and the lessons that he's taught all of us and something to learn along the way. So let me go ahead and read that real quick, and then we'll jump right in. So John B. Taylor is the Mary and Robert Raymond Professor of Economics at Stanford University and the George P. Schultz Senior Fellow in Economics at the Hoover Institution. He is director of the Stanford Introductory Economics Center. He formerly served as director of the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, where he is now a senior fellow. Taylor's academic fields of expertise are macroeconomics, monetary economics, and international economics. He is known for his research on the foundations of modern monetary theory, not the MMT one, but actual monetary theory and policy, which has been applied by central banks and financial market analysts around the world. He has an active interest in public policy. He served as a senior economist in the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 1976 to 1977, as a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 1989 to 1991. He was also a member of the Congressional Budget Office's Panel of Economic Advisors from 1995 to 2001. Taylor served as a member of the California's Governor's Council of Economic Advisors from 1996 to 98 and 2005 to 2010. Not done. There's still more. For 4 years, from 2001 to 2005, Taylor served as Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs, where he was responsible for currency markets, trade and financial services, foreign investment, international debt and development, and oversight of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. He was also responsible for coordinating financial policy with his G7 countries, was chair of the OECD Working Party on International Economics, and was a member of the board of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. His book, Global Financial Warriors, The Untold Story of International Finance in the Post-9/11 World, chronicles his years as head of the International Division at Treasury. His book, Getting Off Track: How Government Actions and Interventions Caused, Prolonged, and Worsened the Financial Crisis, which I would highly recommend, was one of the first on the financial crisis, and he has since followed up with 2 books on preventing future crises, co-editing The Road Ahead for the Fed, and Ending Government Bailouts as We Know Them. His latest book is First Principles, 5 Keys to Restoring America's Prosperity, which was winner of the 2012 Hayek Prize. In 2010, Taylor received the Bradley Prize from the Bradley Foundation and the Adam Smith Award from the National Association for Business Economics for his work as researcher, public servant, and teacher. Taylor was awarded the Alexander Hamilton Award for his overall leadership at the U.S. Treasury, the Treasury Distinguished Service Award for designing and implementing the currency reforms in Iraq, and the Medal of the Republic of Uruguay for his work in resolving the 2002 financial crisis. He was awarded the George P. Schultz Distinguished Public Service Award at Stanford, the Hoagland Prize for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching, and the Rhodes Prize for his high teaching ratings in Stanford's Introductory Economics course. He also received a Guggenheim Fellowship for his research, and he is fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Econometric Society. He formerly served as vice president of the American Economic Association. Previously, Taylor held positions of professor of economics at Princeton University and Columbia University. Taylor received a BA in economics, summa cum laude, from Princeton University in 1968 and a PhD in economics from Stanford University in 1973. John, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a real privilege, and I appreciate all the things you're doing, Vance, and I'm ready for the questions.
All right, let's jump right in. John, we've got a good discussion here today. I'd love to get your kind of introductory thoughts on the economy, just anything that you would like to share that people should know and be paying attention to.
Well, we had a real hit in the pandemic, and GDP fell dramatically, but it recovered dramatically too. And so we're now in a situation where we want to get policy, I'd say, back to normal, back to what works, pro-growth policy. And it's hard because there's lots of disagreements about what's going on, disagreements about the continuation of the pandemic, masks, et cetera. So it's slowing things down, and the first quarter wasn't so great. We'll see what happens in the second quarter as we get the data. But I think the main thing is to focus on economic policy that will stimulate economic growth. That's what's worked in the past. As you mentioned, there's histories to look at. There's what worked and what didn't work, and we have a lot of experience, and we have experience in different countries too. So it's a very challenging time, but I think the more that we can think about what works, and economics is part of that. As you mentioned, I've had lots of experience working in different parts of government, and it's not just the policy, it's how you implement them, and it's such a difference of opinion. We're going through that now. Anyway, that's a quick answer.
Yeah, no, that's good. And as you know, I mean, being inside, the White House or Treasury in this case, there's so many things that are on your desk to look at and figure out, okay, where do we prioritize? I know when I was at the Office of Management and Budget, there were different things that you're looking at and what's coming through and what policies are coming through. I wonder, given your time, what were some of the key highlights that you remember, what you went through and how you really dealt with those trade-offs of which direction you should go to then provide the analysis for the Treasury Secretary and ultimately, the President?
It's a very good question. I think the most dramatic thing was 9/11 and being in there and trying to figure out what to do, keep things stable. I think President Bush had it right the whole time, but there's a real question. What do we do about who did it? What do we do about dealing with who did it? What do we do about the damage? It was a really tough time, I'd say, to hold the line steady and to work with our partners, because it wasn't necessarily just the United States. As you mentioned, the G7, the G20 were very important to bring into the discussion. But this period of time, travel was a little bit less than normal. So I went to maybe hundreds of meetings in this 150 meetings in the Situation Room. And they were all issues of military, diplomacy, State Department, Defense Department were already always weighing in. But what I tried to emphasize, and I think this is so important, is the economics. Don't forget the third leg, so to speak, whatever you call it. The economics is so important, and we tend to forget it. And I remember I mentioned economics, and maybe Rumsfeld would say, there goes Taylor again, talking about the economics. And it was so important to get that straight. It's still important. We tend to forget it. How often do you hear of this terrible struggle that's going on in Ukraine and Russia? How often do you hear about the economic systems, which they're so different? And that's what I would try to stress. And my experience in Washington and also in academia is that you can't forget the basics. Can't forget that about what works. And there's so many examples over time. And I think that's why I like to teach. You can remind students, remind people about this, and write books as well. And actually, if I could say one other thing, I think. Yeah. As you know, the experience in applying things is so different. I actually, one thing you didn't mention, I served in the Navy early on. And, that's the Defense Department is a whole different world. But I think whether it's the CEA or whether it's the State Department, Defense Department, the White House, you realize that these people have to implement the policy. And also, let's not forget Congress. Yeah. And we're not going to just run the show without the Congress. So bringing them in, testifying, making the right calls, it's a difficult thing, and even within your own organization, there's differences of opinion how we proceed. So it's a very important part of policy making, which is actually the making, which we tend to forget. And whether it's you're dealing with the president, you're trying to support the president, whatever it is an important part of what we're doing.
Well, no, I think that's exactly right, and a lot of good lessons there, because it is so important. I think with economics, and I know that you're also a fan of Milton Friedman. I've learned so much from him, and from you and Hayek and others. I think one of the key lessons is that economists is more, trying to figure out the trade-offs. Not necessarily always what we should be doing, but what are going to be the trade-offs there. I think that there are key lessons, though, from economists of what the policy trade-offs are going to be. I remember, speaking of the Situation Room, when COVID hit and we were in the Situation Room with Kudlow and others talking about, well, what are the cases going to do? What's the what are the variations, and how can we forecast these cases? And my kind of point is I think we should be looking more about what's going to happen in the economy if things were to shut down. Things are probably going to slow if there is a progression of the virus across the nation, but shutting things down is going to have a detrimental effect, substantial to the economy. And we saw that. I mean, if you look back to February of 2020, the unemployment rate was 3.5%. The poverty rate in 2019 was the lowest on record, and that was across demographics. We had the highest inflation-adjusted real median household income, across all demographics, or most demographics that are out there. It was a really prosperous time. And whenever you saw what happened over the course of those 2 months, when a lot of the states started to shut down their economies and force people to home and businesses to close and things of that nature, we lost 22 million jobs across the U.S. The unemployment rate went from 3.5% to nearly 15%, substantial increase in the unemployment rate. And so these were things that I think we could have seen more clearly with the trade-offs of economics. Although, of course, we can't look at everything as what happens with the virus and the movement and analyze those things. But those things were pretty clear. And one of the concerns that I had at that time, which maybe you might have had some at 9/11 as well, is how much are we putting the entrepreneurs on the sideline? Because that's where the dynamism and the innovation take place in the private sector. And it was one of the concerns that, I had at that time was, what are we missing? What are the major trade-offs, the opportunity cost going into that situation? And we've seen the results now, but what otherwise could have happened? And we're still, I think, feeling the effects of a lot of those decisions that were made back then. And I wonder, in your analysis, what were some of the other big things that you noticed from, this latest crisis?
Well, the very latest crisis is so unusual because there's the health issues, there's the medical experts, there's the economic experts, and also the foreign policy experts. It is more complicated. Yeah. But I think that's the reason to try to keep it simple. And so I come back to the economics. And you mentioned Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman had a little BMW convertible. He lived at Stanford and San Francisco for a while, but his license plates on the BMW convertible was MV equals PY. Money times velocity equals the price level times real GDP. And the equal sign was not part of the official letters of California license plates. So he would put the equal sign in between. And occasionally the highway patrol would make him take it off. But what he told me the next day, he'd be back. So that is a focus. It's a focus on what's really important. And we're coming back to that all the time. But it's just one aspect. It's good monetary policy, good fiscal policy. I think good regulatory policy, good international policy. They all go together. And that's what I think you're aiming at. How do you get that trade-off into the discussion? And frequently, I think the political system, my observation, tends to exaggerate the trade-offs. There are trade-offs, to be sure. So often, we're in the direction of taking policy for which there's no trade-off. It's the best thing to do for income distribution, best thing to do for defense, best thing to do for diplomacy is to have a stronger growing economy. It all fits together, and we sort of the regulatory policy, the tax policy, the monetary policy is part of that. So I think it's good. I mean, I have been focused on monetary policy for quite a long time, goes back to when I was an undergraduate, but it's just part of the story. And there's similarities. I like to think of rules-based. rules-based is one way to think about a monetary policy where there's not too much discretion given. And we're kind of in that time now where if there was a better description of what we ought to be doing and agreement about that, and we could come back to that, but I think there have been times in American history and also different countries' history where you can learn from experience of what works.
Yep, that wise words. Kind of getting into the economy of where we're at now, and I know it's on a lot of people's minds. It's interesting. I was just reading a Wall Street Journal article today. Today's July 18th, talking about the labor market, right, and how it seems strong. I mean, if you look at the headline numbers, things do look pretty strong. We've got a 3.6% unemployment rate, which it was 3.5% before. Remember February of 2020, before the pandemic and the shutdown. But and there are some other things that seem to be bouncing back. I mean, 372,000 jobs added last month. And wages up 5.1, over 5%. But there are also weaknesses that are out there that indicate that maybe either we're in a recession or we're soon in a recession. We'll see what happens. I mean, GDP in the first quarter was down 1.6%. Atlanta Fed's GDP now estimate shows, negative. I think a negative 1.5% was the latest that I've seen. So that's 2 consecutive quarters. National Bureau of Economic Research that does the dating of these recessions, they will come out with a date later, even if it was right now. But of course, they look at other measures, not just those 2 consecutive quarters, such as industrial production. Well, industrial production, if you look at it inflation adjusted, is negative. Retail sales, negative. There's not good indicators for the economy. And it's something that I've been putting together. I have a recent op-ed talking about this, John, of maybe a zombie economy where we have zombie firms, which has been around for a while, where basically firms are running on debt. They're just being propped up by that debt to keep their operations going. And maybe that might be a lot of small businesses that are out there. In 3 of the last 4 months, small businesses have actually been shrinking jobs, cutting jobs. And so that's one indication that maybe one of the shoes is starting to fall off throughout this process. But even on the labor market, though, I think there may be zombie workers that have changed some of their psyche over the last couple of years. I mean, if you go back to what happened over the last couple of years, there was the CARES Act, a little over $2 trillion. I remember being at the White House looking at these monies that were going out, and we were trying to figure out, okay, how's the Paycheck Protection Program going to work? The Small Business Administration usually has a few $1 billion. Now we're giving them hundreds of billions of dollars. How is that going to process through? There are these handouts that weren't connected to work for employers or for employees. And then you had another bill about $1 trillion later that year that replenished some of the PPP and sent out more checks right at the end of the Trump administration, December of 2020. Then you had the American Rescue Plan Act, another $2 trillion with more handouts not connected to work. $350 billion of state and local governments. And then there was an infrastructure bill, another $1 trillion. I mean, we've seen over the last 2 years, $6 trillion in deficit spending, a massive amount of $30.6 trillion in debt, which is about a little over $90,000 owed per every man, woman, and child across the U.S. And then the Fed has monetized much of that, right? Is their balance sheet went from $4 trillion to $9 trillion. It's slowly trickling down some, but we've seen some of that happening. And you have all this inflation. It goes to the asset prices. We saw that with stock market, bond market, real estate markets, and some of that started to trickle down. I'm just giving kind of an overview of where we're at so we can focus in on some of these areas. But now inflation, whether you look at CPI, 9.1%, the latest number, PCE, 6.3%, change CPI, all of these are at like 40-year highs. And we're seeing the slowing down of the economy now to where the workers, it's like, okay, when are they going to come back? There's maybe 2 million, 3 million of them that are still outside the workforce. Some of them are retired, maybe early. But that's contributing to what I can see or what I've been thinking about it as a zombie economy, where it's tough to get things really going again. And policy keeps basically pushing them down, saying, you know what, it's not time. We're going to overregulate the economy. So too much money chasing too few goods, where those goods have been overregulated and overtaxed and redistributed from the overspending that's been in the economy. And I just wonder kind of what your thinking has been as we're going through this. Do you think that we're in a recession, about to head a recession, or what are your thoughts?
Well, these two negative quarters will make people say that, but I think it's different. I mean, a lot of it can be looked at exports and specific items. So I think it needs to be looked at very carefully. I hope the Business Cycle Dating Committee does that. But I'd say at this point, you mentioned fiscal policy, the deficit, the spending, monetary policy, this zombie economy where people are only half-time working. We've seen all of that. I would say that in each particular case, we know better. So monetary policy, as you mentioned, inflation rate's 9%, and the interest rate is 1.5%. So that's off by any measure. The last time we saw the Fed so off, I call it behind the curve, was in the 70s. And at that point, Arthur Burns, sorry to go back in history, Arthur Burns was the chair of the Fed. And he said, it's not monetary policy. And he looked at Richard Nixon and said, it's you. So he persuaded Nixon to have wage and price controls. And it was really a disaster because the problem was monetary. So it took a long time to get out of that. And then in some sense, we're in a similar situation now, but there's a difference, a big difference. The inflation rate is quite high. The interest rate is even lower than then. And so there's a big gap. And most scholars, most theorists, most monetary experts would say you can't go on at that rate. There has to be an increase in the interest rate to make this work. And as you point out, the quantitative easing makes it harder because the Fed had purchased a lot of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, so their balance sheet is so high. But the main thing they can do now is to raise the interest rate. And I think you're hearing more about that. There's 75 basis points last time, another 75 basis points is being rumored coming up. And so that's in the right direction. And I think the more that we say that this is good for the economy, let me mention one thing that's different now than it was way back when. In the 70s, inflation, it took a long time before inflation crept up. And people just say it's part of the system. We need wage and price control. It was crazy. You're hearing a little bit of that now, unfortunately, but that's not the answer. And so I think in this case, the fact that the inflation rate has picked up, we've been talking about it for a year and a half to be sure, but it's still relatively new compared to the past. So I think it's possible for the Fed to take action which will not hurt the economy. And that's what people worry about. I mean, any action they take will hurt the economy. And it's natural to think of higher interest rates hurting the economy, but interest rates are kind of low if you think about the fact that inflation is quite high. So if there's a way that the Fed can change its stance, and there's a little bit of that, some of the members of the FOMC are talking in this direction, we need to begin to raise rates maybe a little more substantially, 3.5%, 4%. And we'll see what happens. But I think here is the most important part of this thing. Policy needs to be predictable. We can't have surprises. That's what really hurts. Big surprises, you say it's going to be 2 and it's 0. And that's a surprise. And you want to undo that as much as possible. And this goes back to the notion of rules versus discretion. I'm a big proponent of rules, always have been. That's because you can more easily communicate about what your objective is. And if the central bank is communicating, then people understand that they know they're going to raise rates unless inflation comes down. So that automatically begins to bring inflation down. It used to be we had models that showed this, that if the Fed has a credible policy of increasing rates if inflation rises, and of course cutting rates if there's a recession, then that gets built into expectations. And so you can have a better situation than before. But I think you're right. Right now, the inflation rate is there. People are blaming the monetary policy. They're blaming fiscal policy. They're blaming the balance sheet, all sorts of things. But what I think is true of history when we look back and look at different countries too, is that at this point, the rate has to be higher.
Yeah, I've been looking at a lot at that too. And over this period, and it's been interesting to watch the Biden administration kind of walk their way around it with transitory inflation or Putin price hikes, corporate greed. I mean, you kind of name it, they're blaming it on something else. But I think it always goes back to Milton Friedman's view, right? The inflation is always an everywhere monetary phenomenon. And so that is something that we've got to watch, is really where the balance sheet is of the Federal Reserve, the money supply growth and everything else are just so important. And there's been some talk about, how much of the fiscal policy has led to the inflation. And the way that I look at this, John, is the fiscal policy itself is really just redistributing the money around. I want to get your thoughts on this. It's something I've been toying with, and if you have $100 that you want the government to spend, they're going to have to redistribute that $100 from somewhere else, and so there's not really like the aggregate demand increase shifting to the right that's pushing up the economy, because it's got to be redistributed somewhere else. But when the fiscal policy and Congress and Treasury has the increase in the debt, when monetary policy and the Fed buys those debt, puts it on their balance sheet, prints new money, now you have the $105 chasing that $100. Now we can have the inflationary effects of moving aggregate demand to the right. I know that's in a simple way to think about it, but in my mind, the fiscal policy side is not the inflationary part, because there's not new money. It's just redistributed money out of the system. And it goes against, of course, the Keynesian view of economics, where you can fill in that gap, some sort of potential GDP gap, however they want to determine that. And then that can fill that gap in. And some are talking about that even now. I mean, you hear some people are saying that we need to be raising taxes to reduce inflationary pressures, when that seems to be counter to what we need if the economy is slowing and everything else. And it really goes back to the money supply and monetary policy, what the Fed is doing. I mean, look, the fiscal policy can influence that by freeing up resources. You brought this point up earlier. I mean, something needs to be done about pro-growth policies, where we would talk about it at the White House, and others have, about making sure that taxes are low, broadest base possible. We should be looking at what I consider to be cutting government spending, or at least slowing the growth, so that there's a fiscal rule, to your point about expectations over time. Because right now this is unsustainable. Things are coming back down as far as the deficit goes, but that's really because you're having a lot of tax revenue that's coming in, and Congress has stopped doing as much as it did before. And so when we start putting these pieces together, it will be important for us to really understand what were the causes of inflation, and then how should we move forward based on a good fiscal rule. Just to follow up there real quick, is the Atlanta Fed has, kind of a tool that you can use, and you can put in different measures. And I wonder what you kind of think about that based on the Taylor rule.
So the Taylor rule is more about monetary policy, but fiscal policy is very important, as you say. I would say that in a way it's more straightforward to practice is hard, but to say you have a balanced budget rule. You have a deficit in bad times, and you have a surplus in good times, and it averages out to zero. We're not close to that. But I think that would work pretty well. It would really contain the size of the debt, which is another issue, and it would contain fiscal policy. That's a rule. It's a rule that you can decide how big the deficit should be in recessions, and how the surplus occurs, vice versa. But I think that's very important, and I wish there was more. There has been talk about that in the past. It's kind of disappeared now, and I think to some extent it's there's less concern about the deficit, but I don't think that'll continue. I think it's basically people saying enough is enough. And I would say one other thing: my research on fiscal policy has looked at the impacts of these temporary packages and rebates, et cetera. And there's no question that they don't stimulate the economy very much. People save them. It depends, you try to aim it to people who need it, but they still save it. And, every study that I've done about the temporary stimulus packages is they haven't worked very well, and that includes the most recent ones. And so the most important thing, and people, it doesn't make sense. If you get $100, aren't you going to spend it? Well, your hard times, your toughest, so you don't spend it right away. So I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. I would also, just to applaud what you're saying, is there's a temptation now to blame the inflation rate on other things. You gasoline prices. It's, believe it or not, still $7 a gallon out here. And I show pictures of that, but that's not, inflation started before then.
Right.
And so you could say it's this and that, but it's not. And so, but it's, who knows? Who pays attention? You get your gas tank filled up and you see how much it costs. And so there's a tendency to do that. And there's a little bit of worry that I have that that's kind of what happened in the 70s. People said it's not monetary policy. But I think it's different now, and I do hear more people talking about monetary policy. I think the Fed probably should go a little faster than it's going now. But the notion that you just fill a gap with fiscal policy just doesn't work at all. And I think that these rules for fiscal policy are good. By the way, rules for monetary policy have never disappeared. They're still there. We had some legislation which came close to passing, as you know. And we may get back to that. One bright aspect is I think people are beginning to see this easy policy and I just call it easy because the rate is so low compared to what the inflation rate is. But they're seeing that associated with this rise of inflation. So it sort of makes sense. So the interest rate is so low, and we need to make an adjustment. And ultimately, that's good for the economy because by raising the rates sooner rather than later, you have a smoother adjustment and therefore stronger growth rate. So those are the things that I would emphasize. But the times are tough, and you got to think through these things. It's we have a very tough time on all dimensions, military and diplomacy as well as economics.
That's right. I mean, I guess there's some truth to the idea that the Russia-Ukraine war, has contributed to some of the increase in oil prices, but it was at the margin, right? It was after it already ran up quite a bit before then. To blame it all on that is kind of nonsense at the end of the day. Well, one of the things that I was looking at, and I've been working on a lot, John, over the years, and was able to, in the President Trump's last budget, I did get a mention of a fiscal rule that we should be moving in that direction. And I'm hopeful that we can and we will one day. The same thing goes with monetary policy, all this, quantitative easing and the inflationary effects. I think more people are looking at a more strict rule that's needed. I'm also hopeful on the fiscal side, though, with this amount of debt and excessive spending, that there's going to be a need for some sort of a limit, either whether it be a balanced budget sort of amendment, like you mentioned earlier, or a spending limit. One of the things that I've looked at just here recently was over the last 20 years, from 2002 to 2021, the national debt increased by $17.7 trillion, 17.7. Well, if we had just had spending match population growth and inflation over that period, so in inflation adjusted per capita terms, we would actually had a surplus over that period, a reduction in the debt by $1.1 trillion. That's $18.8 trillion swing. Now, of course, you've got wars, you've got the pandemic, you've got other things that are going on, but it kind of indicates that, look, we don't have a revenue problem. We really do have a spending problem that we've got to get around to. And I think states have really started to take that on. And you had Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights, the TABOR that was put in place, which was strong. It was at the state level going down to the local level. It's been weakened over time by Democrats there, but it's still a pretty strong force to be reckoned with. You have states like Texas, where we passed a stronger state spending limit here last year during our legislative session that covers most of general revenue, actually all general revenue. It's based on population growth and inflation, a 3/5 majority vote. And it's something that we're hoping to do this next session here is to bring that down to the local level. Because what you see in places like Texas, you have a different problem in California, but you have basically blueberries in a sea of red. Right? When you think about it politically, to where you have your Austins, your Houstons, your Dallases, they're growing by leaps and bounds, their budgets. But that means that taxes are then higher than otherwise because they do have to balance their budgets. And as it grows, as it's more expensive to live in places like Austin, then people move to the suburbs. well, then their taxes go up. And then, you know what I mean? There's a spillover effect that we're seeing. And so one of the things that we're hoping to do is not only have state spending limit, but local spending limits as well. And I think that will help to do something about this affordability crisis, because states can't do a lot, right? I mean, this is really on the Fed as far as inflation and things of that nature, but they can help with the cost of living. And I really think this is a great opportunity for states. I think going into November, my guess is that the Republicans will win a majority in the House, maybe even the Senate. But how much will they be able to get done? Because Biden vetoes and things of that nature. And Biden administration is probably going to do a lot more executive orders to get their things done, right? And so this puts even more pressure, in my view, of the importance of federalism for states to really fight back, provide for sound fiscal policy, deregulation, and really freeing up those resources. But what say you about some of that?
So I think you're very wise to point out the differences in the states within the United States. And there are firms leaving every day from California to Texas. It's the big story, HPE, et cetera. But we hear Musk. What is Musk doing today? And is at any place but Palo Alto. Yeah. One of the good things is Zoom. Zoom is invented by a young man just a couple miles from here in Cupertino. So I think that the states can do a lot, and you're seeing evidence of that. Texas, Florida versus California, just to be simple about it. And you're seeing movement. Now, the question is how fast that adjusts. And I think what it requires is more writing, more demonstration. There's no question, if you go to the parking lots near where I live, there's a lot of empty lots. Now, part of that is because people are working at home, but as far as part of it is they're leaving. They're going to where you are, Texas, and there's a lot of advantages to that. But I think that what I would hope that this makes a difference. Right now, the high-tech firms are under attack by both sides. It's really and I think sort of saying what they're doing, what they're not doing, be more specific about it. It would make a difference. Also, this carries over to international. How are we treating our firms internationally? What's going on with respect to this, to Facebook, et cetera? And so I think we can't forget that has to do with regulation, obviously, what kind of regulatory apparatus should be on these high-tech firms, and certainly the valve that you can move from California to Texas is a big part of it. And I think if people really understand that a little bit more, some people say, what difference does it make? But the state is hurting. There's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of homelessness, et cetera. In San Francisco, you see that. So I think that people have to make that connection. So far, it's not enough. And I think what you just said makes a big difference, Vance.
Yeah, John, I mean, this is something I've been writing, quite a bit about and trying to show those differences, because it also shows the importance of institutions. One thing about Texas that we talk about a lot is the Texas model, which is not just that rugged independence like we like to have as individuals, but you also have no personal income tax, which I think is huge. We have relatively less government spending than a lot of other places, sensible regulatory climate, just a good place to do business and a good lawsuit climate. I mean, those things are a way for businesses to flock to Texas. When Caterpillar moved here recently from Illinois, that made it the number 54 of the Fortune 500 companies that could be anywhere in the world or any other state are right here in Texas. And I think that's part of the reason is, it's a good place to do business, a good educated workforce. And you see some of these differences where Texas has no personal income tax. California has one of the highest in this progressive income tax system. We have sensible regulation. They don't. and where do you want to do business? And you're right. People move with their feet. That's one of the things we talk a lot about in economics is incentives matter. And when you can sell a home in California, Palo Alto, wherever, and come and buy a larger home at a lower cost in Texas, although Austin's getting pretty expensive now too. Not quite California, but why wouldn't you do that to improve and be able to, let people prosper in the sense of what this show is all about is you get those opportunities. And I'm hopeful that we can see that again in DC. I wonder what are some of the key policy initiatives that you would have, and we talked about it some, I think, already with rules, but what else would you be advocating for at the federal level?
Well, I think that you have opportunities on taxes to reduce the tax rates, not increasing them, at least hold them steady. Sometimes when the forces are against you, which they seem to be, just holding steady is a victory. Mm-hmm. And then depending on what happens to the Senate and the House, you perhaps press a little more. Here, I think, by the way, what's happening in the White House next time is a big thing. What the race is going to be like, what the issues. I hope the issues are more what we're talking about. But I think those are the things that have to be done. I think on the regulatory side, there's just so many. I think I just worry about we're forgetting these high-tech firms are a huge benefit wherever they are in Texas, California, Florida, New York. So they're providing a huge benefit, but we shouldn't forget that. And it's hard to do because the popularity is to dump on these firms. They're just not very appealing. So those are the things to do. I would like to see more emphasis on less regulation, more emphasis on monetary policy, more emphasis on fiscal policy, as you're saying. And I think the fiscal and monetary we're moving. I don't see too much on the regulatory side. And then one thing which we've not discussed too much on this is the international. It's so important for the U.S. to be in the lead here, and our system, what works, what doesn't, and we really can't get behind. My experience, say the Undersecretary of International Affairs and working in the White House, is those international things are important in developing our allies who are like-minded and think about the economics part of this as well, whether it's the UK or Germany or whatever it happens to be. Japan, I like the extra attention we're paying to Japan recently. So I think those are key things, and I wish we did more of that and more focus on those things, because we've seen what works, what doesn't work, and that's what I would do. And the international involves exchange rates. It involves central banks with more than one country. There's a lot of reforms to do, but actually the real worry I have short term is the inflation rate. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Well, rightfully so. Rightfully so. I think spot on, though, too, about the international sort of issues that are going on. I mean, one of the things that longer term, what I'm kind of concerned about is the slowing population growth, the domestic population growth, maybe even contracting. And so immigration is also going to be important. And I think I'm also a strong believer, as a classical liberal and of rule of law, where we need to make sure that it's legal migration, but that also probably means that we're going to need to have more reforms within that space. I've been more in favor of like a market-based sort of immigration system, and it's important to have that strength along the border, knowing who's coming in and out. Maybe if there's a way to pair those two. What are some of your thoughts on the immigration or population issue moving forward?
Well, I think you have the law. Just fix the law and don't vary on that. I think the rule of law is so important with respect to immigration, respect to everything, quite frankly. We tend to forget it. And one other thing which is related to other things to do is the schools. There's a lot of opportunity for reform. Some school districts are better than others. Some are really hurting a lot. But I think that's the future. Some kids are suffering quite a bit, and parents don't know exactly what to do about it. But I'd say, I'm involved in education and looking for ways to improve it through online stuff like that. But I'm not teaching fourth grade or third grade, and that's really where we need to do more. And I think basically, maybe vouchers are the way to do with it. Certainly in some areas, that's the way to do with it. There's more emphasis on that. So I would say the deregulation, you can't forget the education part of that. It's really where many of the improvements are coming. But so I think in just the general question is, I talk about monetary policy, I talk about fiscal policy, but we cannot forget about regulatory policy. That may be the biggest difference. Get the other stuff right, but the regulatory side gets the politics, and I think right now we get distracted. How it seems less important than the other things. It doesn't get the headlines. But I think that, move for firms moving from California to Texas. You maybe want to brag about that. I want to complain about it, but I wish wish neither of us bragged or complained, but we did something about it. It's
Right.
international here too.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that regulation is where you get the fourth branch of government that ends up being bureaucracy. And I saw that, and you saw that at the White House. A lot of times, it's really more behind the scenes who's running the game compared to a lot of the bills that are passed. And it is something that needs to be under control more.
Yeah, I think I think the members of Congress can do more. There has been less discussion of these kinds of issues in the last few years than I think is right. There used to be a lot more. You go back to Reagan or whatever, even Bush. There was a lot more discussion than there is now. So I'm not quite sure why that's the case. Maybe that's the question: is how can we have more of a discussion of what we need, and we who thought about this know needs to be done, and to work with. I think I've always liked to work with politicians who have the right approach, not with the wrong approach, because that's the first step. It's not always exactly the right thing, but it's in the right direction. So I think supporting people who have these missions is an important part of the thing, and that's what I would add to what you're saying. We're in a political world, and people, the president, the members of Congress, the cabinet have a lot to say, and so their attitude makes a big difference. And it may be, in some sense, to get around the details that you're worried about. That's what you need to do. You have people with the right mindset, so they know what to do. They have a better idea of what to do in this difficult situation. When there are these trade-offs that you mentioned, hey, that's not really a trade-off. Here's what we got to do. Yes, there's a trade-off. Here's what we got to do. And so that's discussed, and different people have different views, which is great in a democracy, but you need to sort out which is the right view, so to speak.
Yeah, certainly. I think, too, kind of going back to where we started, right, is trade-offs that you mentioned is just so important. And education, I think, is a key one. I think what Arizona passed recently under Governor Ducey with education savings accounts is probably the gold standard. So you have a number of options that you can use with those dollars. I'm hopeful that we can get that in Texas. Texas likes to be number one. And right now, we are not number one when it comes to education freedom, what we're calling parent empowerment, because parents really should be empowered to meet the unique needs of each one of their kids, and and be in the know about what they're being taught. There's a lot of stuff that's out there that people don't know as much anymore, and they don't have the incentives in place to be in the know, given the situation that they're in. If they have more choices and more competition, they would improve. I think a lot of that, and help them to be more prosperous over time. You probably heard about the success sequence where graduate from high school, you get a full-time job, you get married before you have kids. In that order, you're 97% chance of not being in poverty. And I think a big part of that, though, is education. And if we can't provide a better education system for our kids, we're going to have problems in the future, because then it's going to be more difficult to find those well-paid jobs and to find those matches of getting married, which is another huge decision. There's a lot of trade-offs, but the person you marry may be one of the biggest influences on your life that it is. I know it is with my wife and everything, and then you have kids later, and now it's a whole other thing. So these are all trade-offs that come in, which are so important to a person's outcomes.
That's for sure. That's for sure. One of the things that we also could talk more about, maybe in the future, is whether this medium we're using now could be used more in education, the online stuff and what's going on. There's a tendency, online, the kids aren't going to pay any attention. But my experience is, no, they may pay more attention if it's done right. And there's improvements. And to some extent, that may be part of the answer. We're going to be in a hybrid world of some kind going into the future. And that's certainly true of colleges. I have, online courses that people watch all over the world. And that's good in the sense we're communicating what we think is correct, what we think is the right way to proceed. But I would say just think about the technology that we can use. You're mentioning some of the complementary things that we could be thinking about. I agree with that. But there's also the technology, which is changing so rapidly. We didn't have this method 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever. It's just changed. And that is something that I maybe see more of, and you see more of being involved in this world than you do if you're outside and working with the farm or whatever. It's a little bit, but even there's quite a bit. And internationally, that's one thing I could just maybe. We're getting close to the end, but internationally, it's amazing what we know and what we don't know about what's happening in Ukraine. And that we should know more, but it's amazing how much we do. You can watch the internet, you can watch the TV, you can watch what's going on, and you can see what Putin's doing. You mentioned that a few minutes ago. It's so important these days. The world is getting smaller, and it's because of this technology. And it's not. Travel is down, that's for sure. But the way we're talking to each other is up tremendously. And I think if we could do more of that. And that's what I would, as a teacher, as educator, I would be doing more of. But also, policy is very much related to these things because there's different ways to go about, different ways to get things done. So I would add that too.
Well, I think you're right on, John. And, our time is running out here. But speaking of medium and being able to do something online, it's a pleasure to have this time with you here today. I would love to do it again. We probably have a number of other things that we could talk about, but I think we hit on some of the key ones about, where we've been, where we're at now, where we should be heading, fiscal, monetary rules, education, different mediums, international influences that are going on. All these are going to be key things to let people prosper, overall. So thank you for everything that you do, John, and have done, and help me learn about not only economics, but also policy, which is part of economics and the trade-offs. And I look forward to keeping these conversations going. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. And this prosperity is what it's after, what we're going to do. And thanks to you, we'll do more of it. So thank you very much.